All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on this lovely sort of autumn day. Really pleased to be here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Mark Lantain. I'm a senior researcher here at UNPKO, looking at various areas of Asia and international relations. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce a very old friend of mine who has come from a very long way, meaning Canada, to talk about some of her very recent work on the very complicated subject of United Nations peacekeeping. It's a very old saying that victory has many parents, but defeat is an orphan. Rarely has this expression been more appropriate when talking about UN peacekeeping, especially when you look at the kind of advent of so-called robust peacekeeping, which began in the 1990s. We've heard quite a bit about the subject of peacekeeping success and failure. There have been some, obviously, missions which did not turn out according to plan. We're talking about, let's say, Rwanda, Bosnia, and so forth. But since that time, there's also been a lot of discussion about, well, how do you define, especially when we talk about current peacekeeping missions, how do you define success? How do you define a problem or a setback? How do you define failure? These are not questions which are as easy to answer as at first blush, and it's for that reason that we're very pleased to be hosting our guest speaker this afternoon, who's going to be discussing this area. This has formed a major part of her research, and this research has involved quite a bit of travel, quite a bit of hard data gathering, and quite a bit of excellent writing. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah-Myriam Martin-Brûlé, excuse me. She is Associate Professor of Politics and International Studies at Bishop's University in Quebec, but she also wears quite a few other hats. She is also, also an Associate Faculty Member of the Centre for International Peace and Security Studies, the Montreal Centre for International Studies, and the Réseau des Opérations de la Paix, also in Quebec, and an organization I'm quite familiar with, the Inter-University Consortium for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at McGill. So her research, since her graduate studies, had looked at various areas of UN peacekeeping, not only in terms of the success or failure of peace operations, but also the specific operations of the UN within weak and fragile states. Now, for her graduate work, the major case studies that were looked at were Somalia, which obviously has been getting quite a bit of dialogue about the peacekeeping mission there, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Now, it's at this time that her research has culminated in a brand new book, which we're very happy to talk about today. And hopefully we'll be able to get a bit of a dialogue going, a bit of a discussion going about the whole concept of success and failure in UN peacekeeping. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sarah-Myriam. You have the floor. Thank you.
First, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me and to UNPKO for this wonderful invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to present my book today to you and to go forward with this discussion on what is success and what is failure. So in this book, as Mark so well introduced, I examine peace operations in failed states where interventions were undertaken by regional and international organizations, as well as regional and international great powers. Somalia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia have been qualified as the worst context for transitional politics. Yes, in my book, I refute the pessimism about peace operations in these contexts. This book focuses on the conditions under which peace operations succeed in failed states, and I address two main questions. What is peace operation success, and what contributes to such an outcome? But first, I would like to tell you a bit about how this book came about. Maybe we could get married. That's how ended an interview with a warlord. We laughed, and I politely declined the offer of this very senior leader who was, after all, married already many times over. Such a proposition was, of course, very unappealing on so many levels. The rebel group in question was responsible for the deaths of thousands of civilians, was responsible for committing serious abuses, massive rape, recruitment of child soldiers, kidnapping of refugees, subjecting hundreds of civilians to forced labors. At the same time, this interview with a Liberian belligerent who had been an active participant and even a partial architect of the wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia, who had orchestrated raids and missions both for and against external interveners, was an extremely appealing intellectual opportunity for someone who studied the impact of the military strategies employed by peace operations in intrastate war within failed state settings. So by talking to this leader, I was able to gain an insider's perspective on many different issues: the motives behind the group's actions, the strategies employed, and the perception of the population, the perception about the external interveners' aims and means. So he explained to me how, in the absence of a great power interventions, his group was formed as a last-ditch effort to save the people from governmental abuse. He explained how the group had to fight, since the intervention of regional interveners were not only inefficient, but had become part of the problem. He detailed the shattered hopes following the UN intervention. He recalled how his group helped international mission, but ironically, how little the UN recognized his contribution. He described how his men took the uniforms of the less equipped UN contingents and carried out their more demanding tasks. He explained how and why some contingents of blue helmets were then accused of violating the rules of engagements. So according to this leader, since it was not the peacekeepers, but rather the rebel disguised as peacekeepers who carried out certain of those task designs for blue helmet, it was unsurprising that they either didn't know the rules of engagement or simply chosen not to follow them. He also said that given some of the UN contingents' known lack of adequate equipment and training, and given their poor knowledge of the terrain, rebels were ready to help the blue helmets in their mission to reestablish peace in the country. So throughout the interview, the ex-belligerent stressed how his people had hoped for forceful intervention akin to the one that the Americans did in Somalia in 1991. And it is this initial intervention, that sparked my initial interest for peacekeeping missions. And that dates back to December 1991. The powerful TV image of US Marines disembarking on the beaches of Mogadishu. The beautiful white sand beach, the turquoise water juxtaposed with fully geared helicopter, fully geared American, and AK-toting kids watching them were immediately striking. The mix of beauty and fear, of forceful deployment and vulnerability was fascinating to me. Was it really the best way to save them? And who exactly was them? All these naive questions would ultimately motivate me to learn about the underlying issues, how we effectively intervene in what seems to be the worst of all scenarios, that is, intrastate war within failed states. 18 years later, when I first went to sub-Saharan Africa to do my field research for this book, I was again struck by the same flashes of vulnerable beauty and fear that I had first perceived on television. During the course of my interviews, I was amazed at the coded language and carefully formulated vocabulary used by local actors. Former rebel leaders spoke in terms of games of power, of big power's interests, and even of deterrence. The acuity of the actors, of the population, and particularly the extent of their knowledge of the interveners was a surprise to me. It confirmed the intuitive sense of the importance of communication in an intervention and highlighted the significance of the proverbial tourism, know your enemy, to which a caution could be appended, because maybe your enemy knows you. So going to the Somali refugee camps in the contested Ogaden region of Ethiopia was, of course, an eye-opening experience. At the camp, I interviewed Somali refugees who had left Somalia at various times, at the beginning of the war in 1992, some after the UN interventions in 1995, and some after the second round of war between the Islamists in the year 2000s. Again, I was struck by the extent of the knowledge and the awareness of these refugees. Perhaps the long days spent in the camps, coupled with the system of internal schoolings that was organized by the elders, had given them the time to recall their past and to begin to make sense of it. We mostly talked about events in the 1990s, but particularly the American and the UN interventions. What immediately became clear was the extent to which they were aware of the subtleties of the various interventions, from the tensions between the different contingents to the dynamics within their relationship. They were thus able to tell a Canadian researcher that they liked Canada because the country had punished soldiers that had committed abuses, and that they liked the Americans because they made them feel secure. I was intellectually inspired by these interactions, as well as pushed to challenge some of my own preconceived idea. The extent of the passivity frequently attributed to the peace cap or the population, the extent of the rebels group rogue behavior, and the extent to which the power of communication should never be underestimated. So this was the beginning of my quest. What matters in peace operation? What matters for them to succeed? The challenge of defining success comes from the multidimensionality of peace operations success. Many authors have taken a grasp at the concept by identifying the mandate or the initial ambitions of peace operations as the reference to determine its success. Yet using peace operations mandate as they are written to evaluate success presents a twofold problem. First, it's problematic because they are highly political. Mandates are made strategically ambiguous to satisfy the member states of the Security Council and to ensure flexibility in order to adapt to changing conditions. So if we were to assess peace operations outcome, focusing on the mandate only, this assessment would end up being more about the clarity of the mandate than about the achievements of the operation itself. The focus would then be more on the quality and feasibility of the mandate rather than on its accomplishment. So following this logic, the broader and the more ambiguous a mandate, then the less chance of the peace operation succeeding. And indeed, the third peacekeeping operations in Somalia, UNOSOM II, deployed between 1993 and 1995, is a prime example of this problem. In this case, the operation mandate was broad, unclear, and unrealistic in terms of goals and means deployed. Those who have qualified this operation as an outright failure have not looked at the whole context. If UNOSOM had been given a more realistic or precise mandate, the operation would have been certainly judged a greater success, particularly given the constraints and the challenges that it faced in light of its accomplishment. And indeed, over the course of 2 years, it is estimated that 250,000 lives were saved. Also extremely significant is the fact that the number of refugees dropped from 1.5 million to 750,000. The operation also brought unprecedented amount of money in the country. It created employment opportunities, which stimulated and reinforced legitimate business. The operation succeeded in eradicating starvation, and by the end of the operation, the most vulnerable population groups were receiving food aid, food for work schemes were established to help the rehabilitation of schools and hospitals, as well as water, sanitation, and other services. So this example illustrates the second issue related to considering mandates. By focusing on the mandate, one must take into account not only the mandate as it is written, but also on what is actually implemented, what is being achieved. Hence, in this consideration of mandate, one must look at the actual accomplishment and opportunities created by the intervention, and that was identified by authors such as Bellamy and Williams. But second, to look at what is being accomplished that falls outside of the initial ambitions of a peace mission. Peace missions are organic pieces. In order to succeed, they must adapt. Hence, the initial mandate cannot be fixed threshold for success. To me, the criteria of success remain the extent to which authority and capacity of institution is restored in the wake of peace operations and at the task achieved by the operation because of the peace operation. Important achievements can develop through the presence of the interveners, and these achievements must be taken into account when measuring success. These challenges can come from hostile contexts, giving peace operations limited resources and duration. The United Nations operation pour enormous amount of money as well as sizable employment opportunities. They thus help to stimulate and strengthen legitimate business, shifting activities away from war economy towards other services such as construction, telecommunication, trade services, etc. And in the process, it helped to reshape local interests in security and rule of law, and eventually in local power as well. So many accounts of success focus on humanitarian and political development in the capital city. Yet we need to pay attention to its impact in improving living conditions in the rest of the country. Is the population receiving humanitarian assistance? Are the schools and hospitals being rebuilt? Are internally displaced people and refugees returning to their home or country? And more importantly, one must look at the local, regional, international initiatives aiming at restoring peace. Does the peace operations facilitate the process for political factions to compete politically, to lead and establish power-based through state institutions? So the challenge remains to find a balance between keeping the peace as the sole reference point, between keeping the mandate as the sole reference point and excluding it entirely for the assessment of a peace operation outcome. In addition to the mandate, I look at another key element, and that is order. Order is often parts of larger mandate. Yet to me, to take apart order, the order dimension allows a focus on the extent to which institutional authority and capacity is established. To define order dimension, I employ Huntington's definition of order, which is a function of authority and capacity. So authority is the power to command without having to threaten the use of coercion, and which must be independent of enforcement or of the specific person who rules. And capacity refers to the monopoly over coerced use of force, which should ideally be legitimate, but not necessarily. So it extends as well to the importance of being able to establish a certain degree of stability, which sometimes can be at the cost of legitimacy. And indeed, this points out to the fact that sometimes order is reestablished without the mandate being accomplished. And this leads to the second puzzle of this book. How can we define success when all the different dimensions of success of peace operations do not always go together, when they are not always compatible? How do we address blurry outcomes? The challenge lies, of course, in clarifying thresholds that will delineate a failed peace operations from a successful one. So in my book, I introduce intermediate categories to define outcomes between success and failure, and to refine the understanding and classification of scenarios in which different dimensions of success are not compatible. So to do so, I define success by combining two dimensions, the establishment of order and the accomplishment of the mandate. Hence, I define a successful peace operation at ones that allow the establishment of institutional authority and capacity, and one in which the mandate is accomplished. In weighing the two dimensions, I argue that the reestablishment of order is more important than the accomplishment of the mandate. Peace operations are deemed partial failure when they fail to reestablish order, yet succeed at accomplishing their mandate. And by contrast, partial success is achieved when the peace operations has reestablished order without accomplishing its mandate. The book focuses on peace operations which were carried in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Somalia. And within 20 years, 11 peace operations took place in intrastate wars waged in these three African states. The operations took place at different time periods, had different regional implications, were carried for different lengths of time, had different strategies and types of interveners. In each area, some peace operations succeeded and others failed. So the analysis of these 11 peace operations provided a unique and precious laboratory for comparative politics. The three states had in many ways comparable recent histories, yet at the same time, each case study highlighted different aspects of the strategies employed, the actors involved, and the outcomes of their action. The comparative method allowed me to conduct both within case comparisons and across case comparisons. And indeed, each of these countries has known at least two peace operations with relatively similar mandates, with widely different composition, structure, and strategy. They also fall into what Doyle and Sembanis have called the fifth ecology, where there are many incoherent, hostile factions in a desperately poor economy. So according to Doyle and Sembanis, the prospects appear to be even grim for effective peace building in the countries belonging to this fifth ecology. I demonstrate in this book that there's a diversity of peace operation outcomes within each country, a diversity that does not appear in Doyle and Sembanis' data, since they limited their study to UN peace operation that happened prior to 2001. In this book, I thus study these 11 peace operations that occurred between 1990 and 2009 in three states. But a key question is, how does the literature define peace missions? We cannot rely only on the name of the missions. Notably, if there are changes in mandate, resources, type of intervener, we have to consider that a mission has changed even though it keeps the same name. So that was the case for UNOSOM 1 and 2. So although the mission remained UNOSOM, a distinction was made by the UN itself between the two missions given the change of mandate, the change of resources, of interveners, and of course of strategy. However, the distinction was not made in the case of UNAMSIL, probably because of the continuity in its activities. But in my book, I justify the need to distinguish two parts of that peace operations that I separate between UNAMSIL 1 and UNAMSIL 2, given the change of mandate, given the change of interveners, notably with the intervention of the British, and of course with their change of strategy. So the peace operations covered in this book are missions carried by the UN or by a member state, such as the United Nations in the case of Restore Hope, or by the Economic Community of the West African States, ECOWAS, which acted under the UN Security Council authorization, with or without the consent of the parties to the conflict. My book draws upon official documents and expert reports. I reviewed speeches, debates, and especially official and administrative documents from the UN, ECOWAS, as well as a wide variety of published sources. But more importantly, my research on peace operations on each of these peace operations was also supplemented by interviews with key figures of commanders of troops, officers in ECOMOG mission, with spokesmen and military advisors of Liberian rebel groups. And I also went to the Ogaden region to interview Somali refugees who live in 3 of the main Somali cities at the time of peace operations in Somalia from 1991 until 1995. And I went as well to South Africa to interview various experts. So their insights and experiences provided me with some insider's view to the conflict and helped me to hone the ideas presented in this book. In my research, I found that peace operations can succeed even in the worst context when 2 conditions are met: when there's an intervention of a great power and when there's an adoption of a deterrent strategy. So the examination of these 11 peace operations revealed that success is less linked to the actual use of force than to the possibility of using it. Yet this capacity must be powerful enough to deter. So the use of force often entails collateral damage, which hinders peace process. Yet in violent settings, the presence of a powerful capacity to use force is necessary to convince the belligerents not to commit the prohibited actions. Hence, beyond the adopted strategy and the means deployed, the presence of a great power was key. And this brings attention to the importance of the type of actor involved in peace missions, but also on the intrinsic limits of UN peace operations. The operations the UN operations, require coordination and sharing of troops, equipment, and information, which reinforce the idea of common responsibility related to conflict resolution. And in this sense, the UN is a unique forum because it gathers all the member states in the world. Regional collective interveners also present unique forum, and indeed there has been a call for increased role of regional interveners to be more involved in peacekeeping missions, due notably to the familiarity with the geophysical and human terrain. Hence, they are seen as more apt to intervene efficiently. However, this very familiarity with the terrain can reveal as bias against or for a party to conflict. So too often they lack the resources, training, equipment necessary to accomplish their mandate. However, great powers such as the US, France, and the UK have the capacity to intervene. They have the trained troops, the equipment, the logistics, and the credibility that goes with it. My findings in comparing outcomes are the following. In terms of success, UNITAF, UNMIL, and UNAMSIL Part 2 produce a level of success that previous peacekeeping operations had been struggling to achieve for a number of years. Order was reestablished and the mandate was accomplished. By contrast, UNOMIL, UNAMSIL, and UNOSOM-1 failed to accomplish their mandate and to reestablish order. Most interestingly, I found that intermediary results were not isolated cases and that peace operations equally generate blurry outcomes. ECOMOG missions in Liberia and Sierra Leone, as well as UNISOM-2, accomplished their mandate by saving lives, reducing the number of refugees, eradicating starvation, improving political landscape, and convincing belligerents to negotiate. Yet, they still failed at reestablishing order, leaving countries in which tensions and violence were still rampant, with raids against the governments, the citizens, or in the case of Liberia, although a government was formed, state apparatus was made an extension of the new president's power. So institutional authority was thus deficient. ECOMIL and UNAMSIL Part 1 succeeded in reestablishing order, stabilizing the security situation both in the countryside and in the capital, yet they both failed at accomplishing their mandate, the DDR programs being delayed, belligerents remained disinterested in complying with the terms of the peace accords being negotiated, and they impeded the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Hence, each peace operations were studied in function of their outcome. In Liberia, it took 20 years for an operations to succeed. In my chapter on Liberia, I examined 4 peace operations. UNOMIL, which was a failure, ECOMOG in Liberia, which turned out to be a partial failure, ECOMIL, the ECOWAS mission in Liberia with a partial success, and UNMIL, which is finally a success. Then I examined peace operations in Sierra Leone. The UN Observer Mission in Sierra Leone, ECOMOG in Sierra Leone, UNAMSIL 1 and UNAMSIL 2, and just like the operations in Liberia, this follows an order of failure, partial success, and finally success. Somalia presents a case of success amidst failure, and the case of Somalia was key to highlight the fact that failures and success do not necessarily follow a chronological order. Hence, by examining 3 peace operations, UNOSOM-1, UNITAF, and UNOSOM-2, it turns out that these operations went from failure to success to partial failure. So in my research, in a context of a 5th ecology, in what we could call the worst context, when there are no deterrent strategy and no intervention of a great power, all operations turned out to be failures. Hence, for UNOMIL, UNAMSIL, and UNOSOM-1 to act under Chapter 6 to be restricted in terms of authority and capacity to use force discredited the interveners. These 3 operations showed that these kinds of interventions in such contexts not only fail at stopping violence, but might actually trigger it. Because such operations are perceived as benign and benign risk for the belligerents, this becomes an indicator for the belligerents to target the resources and the interveners themselves, and hence the insecurity for both civilians and intervening troops. My research also shows that for the ECOMOG mission in Liberia and Sierra Leone, as well as for UNOSOM-2, the adoption of a coercion strategy, so that is the use of force to persuade actors to commit a certain action, in a peace operations led by a big power, facilitated the accomplishment of the mandate, of the task planned in the mandate, yet hindered its capacity to restore order. For missions like ECOMIL and UNAMSIL-1, in which a deterrent strategy was adopted without the intervention of a great power, order was reestablished, yet the mandate was not accomplished. In the specific case of ECOMIL, at the end of the mission, the environment around Monrovia, the capital, was secured and humanitarian organizations could resume their activities. But ECOMIL's presence had decreased the fighting by rebels. The intervention also appeased the fears of rebel groups which were fighting, since no organization were defending them. I identified 3 cases of success: UNITAF, UNMIL, and UNAMSIL. And in all 3 cases, a combination of deterrent strategy and intervention of a great power led to fewer casualties and less fighting with the parties in conflict. All 3 missions have in common to have invested in communication with the population and to have sustained good communication with their troops and with the actors and organizations outside of their mission and of the country. UNAMSIL, UNMIL, and UNITAF invested significant means in establishing good communications, and they help maintain wide support for their mission, both at home, abroad, and of course in the host countries. So for all of these 3 operations, order was reestablished and the mandate was accomplished largely thanks to the quantity and quality of the material deployed by the peacekeepers, whose ranks included a great power. So these operations show that capacity also matters, but not so much in terms of quantity, but in terms of whether the equipment and means are tailored to the setting of the interventions. Also, in all 3 operations, the great power's strong commitment to the peace operations, as well as to the operation latitude and capabilities granted to the peace operations forces, convinced the belligerents to avoid prohibited actions. Reputation and known interests were used to adapt the intervention to the settings and to the populations. And such adaptation was key in assuring both the reestablishment of order and the accomplishment of the mandate. 2 main lessons emerged from my book. First, you cannot win on the cheap. Interveners need to invest in communication, cultivate knowledge, and have the capacity to show resolve. The second lesson is that boots on the ground matter and that a great power needs to send troops alongside a UN peace operation for it to succeed. So in my book, I did put forward a new definition of peace operation success based on the establishment of order and the accomplishment of mandate. And based on my research, a successful peace operation is one that allows the establishment of institutional authority and capacity, and one in which the mandate is accomplished. My book refutes the pessimism about UN peace operations in countries that fall into what was called the 5th ecology, so in the worst context. I argue that even in the hardest cases, in failed state settings, international peace operations can be effective if the right combination of strategy and interveners is applied. So my research showed that for a peace operation in an intrastate war, the adoption of a deterrent strategy works best for reestablishing order, and that it is the involvement of a great power that facilitates best the accomplishment of the mandate. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So certainly what we have here is yet further evidence that when we talk about United Nations peacekeeping, the situation is very rarely zero-sum in terms of success or failure. So, and we were talking a bit before about 2 other peacekeeping missions where these kinds of complications either have come up or may come up, the case of Mali and the case of the Central African Republic. So I have a few comments, but I want to open up the floor to questions first. So maybe I'll collect a few questions and go from there. Would anyone like to start? Yes, please. We have a microphone here. Also, if people can identify themselves, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Kathleen Jennings. I'm from FAFO here in Oslo. And thank you for a very interesting presentation. I look forward to checking out your book. But I just, on your very last point, I want to push you a little bit, I guess, because you said that your work helps refute the pessimism about UN peace operations. And in a way, I mean, yes, that's your findings do show that with the sort of core, or with the asterisks that if you have a great power involved. And of course, you have had in Mali, the French involvement, but of course, Central African. I mean, in a way, it doesn't necessarily refute, I would say, the structural problems that peace operations are dealing with, more that if you have a peace operation plus, then you are more likely to have a successful outcome. Whereas if you have a sort of run-of-the-mill peace operation without this great power involvement, it's not looking so positive. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about what this might mean for the sort of next few years of peace operations, where we're in an era now with with Trump, with Brexit, with France is not exactly looking very, I mean, I guess Canada is trying to get more involved in peace operations, but the great power interest in doing this kind of stuff, if it ever was very strong, is certainly is on the back burner, I would say. So what sort of implications do you see that Canada and other Europeans are going to step in, or how might this play out? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, do you want me to?
Maybe I'll collect one or two more questions. Jan?
John Colstrud, also here at NUPI, or Ahmed here at NUPI, sorry. I would like to continue, but in the same route in a way, because can't you say that normally a UN peace operation is deployed when there is not sufficient interest from great powers, to take on the job themselves? So it's kind of the international pecking order where you go from coalitions of the willing, or a direct intervention from a member state, to coalitions of the willing, to such a NATO and those kind of operations, and to then UN, and then maybe AU and REX, and that's kind of the hierarchy. So when you move to a UN operation, unfortunately, there is perhaps not sufficient interest from some of the international powers that could make a difference, and you see it again and again. CAR is, for example, just on its way off the map again after a short time in the spotlight. So that was one thing, and then I would like you to perhaps talk a little bit more about what you mean about with failed states. It's a long discussion, but I'm just thinking that there are so many other forms of authority in these states, although you can call them, or some call them, failed, that they continue to move on, and there must be some forms of authority there. CAR could again be an example where there is no the central authority governing the rest of the country. It wasn't when I was there in 7-8 years ago, and probably not today either. So just a few thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both, for very stimulating questions. Thank you. To answer the first questions, with regards to peace operation, or the disinterest of great powers, and I guess it also echoes Dr. Colstrud's question. The peace operations I looked at from 1990 till 2009, the context of peace intervention has changed tremendously, and because we have a new dimensions. Not only are there belligerents fighting for political agendas, which was the case in the 1990s, but we have this whole radicalization dimension now. And that plays on different ways. It, of course, complexifies the challenges of peace operations, because not only do we deal with belligerents who fight to access to power, but we have also those actors that become more prominent, that do not have a national political agenda, but have transnational agendas, and that are located in other areas. So my book looked at the role of deterrence. How do you deter belligerents within a country? And the premise is that these belligerents want to have some kind of access to resources within a country, some kind of power. Now, the peace operations right now do not deal with those same kind of contexts, because those radicalizing actors, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Boko Haram, they're not looking at an agendas necessarily only in a national basis. So that adds to a new challenge. How do you deter those new actors? But with regards to the interests of great powers, this might come to the other end of the circle, because great powers are interested in international security. By leaving, we know that the Islamic State was able to grow because we left the Islamic State alone from 2013 to 2014, and they were able to gain ground. Of course, if we leave alone areas such as Mali, we know that these organizations will grow, and that will destabilize even more the region, of course, but also the international setting. And that might become an incentive for great powers to be interested in stepping in again. Now, of course, we have the French that are leaving the missions in CAR, but probably due to this dimension of radicalization that is not so present in CAR, but that is present in Mali, and I want to focus more on Mali. You're right about what I'm saying in my book is that great powers have to have boots on the ground, but that also refers to the problem of diffusion of power, if you will, are on this gap that has been identified, of course, by many authors, saying that the pen holders of those mandates are 3 members of the Security Council, Britain, France, and the United States. They are the ones that negotiate, write more the mandates and resolutions, but they're not the one that send the troops and that get killed. And there's a discrepancy here. It's mostly other countries from the developing world that send their troops to be dying. So we have the power center that decides of the resolutions, and then other countries that send their own citizens to die. And there's a discrepancy. It shows that great powers can not only finance peace operations, just give money to that, because the fact that they do finance peace operations raise expectations of the populations that if they are financed by the US, for example, the expectation is that the peace operations will have more means to accomplish the mandate and to reestablish order. Yet, without the great power in place, this does not work. So if they write the resolutions, they need to put boots on the ground and to actually intervene. And that was repeated in my interviews, especially in Liberia, saying that we will not stop until the Americans take us seriously and come here. We know they're financing the operation, but they need to be here. So that would be, and in terms of the question of failed states, this is a crucial question, and you're right, and it's also, it also participates in the definition of what is success and what is failure. For example, most authors that say that Somalia was an outright failure, the UNOSOM II, that ended in 1995, are looking at it from a perspective that Somalia did not have, in 1995, there was no restoration of a government before Siad Barre's government time. But what they failed to look at is what I think Ken Menkhaus shows very well in his book, showing that they were local structures of power that were put in place that were not acknowledged by the UN. So you are absolutely right saying that categorizing failed states in terms as if there was a vacuum and peace operation came in because there was nothing left is a false idea. I use the term because it's part of the categories that are used to show that a state does not have a government that projects power to its borders, and that there's no representation of the government abroad. So I'm using this label, but thank you for your question and showing how careful we have to be with this label that does not take into account, for example, what was put in place in Somalia and that was not reinforced by the external interveners. When the Americans and the UN left in 1995, there were pockets of stability in Somalia held by the clans that were able to govern some pockets of Somalia. And I think Ken Menkhaus writes it so well in his book, showing that there were pockets of stability. This could have been reinforced. That was not recognized. And it shows as well, not to go into the cliche, that sometimes success is in the eye of the beholder. And that's also part of the fact why we cannot base our evaluation of success based on mandates. Because the mandates are written by people in New York. When you're on the ground, you see other things. You need to see benchmarks differently. Benchmarks cannot be decided from New York. You have to see what is the local organization of power. Is there any ways to reinforce that? Of course, this is difficult to do and takes time. It requires knowledge of the local context, and knowledge requires time. So it's not an easy solution either. But that would be my answer to the question. Thank you.
Okay, are there other questions? Sure.
Just directly following on your answer to my question, I mean, where would you then put China in this? I mean, China is becoming a much more active contributor to UN peacekeeping. They are obviously on the P5, but they occupy a different political and normative space than the sort of Western powers. How would you put them into your sort of typology or matrix?
Thank you for your question. I have to say that in my book, I do not cover those cases because China, from 1990 to 2009, were not the great powers that were intervening in the cases that I studied. So I do not cover this myself. Now, can we extrapolate? We could. Of course, we know that China has promised a re-engagement of troops, and it was boosting its troops, I think, 14,000 troops. But of course, I think this question would be much better answered by Mark, who's a specialist of China.
I wouldn't say specialist, but yeah, if I can just jump in. Yeah, China's peacekeeping policy is still pretty much a work in progress, although obviously we've seen very substantial changes. Like, it wasn't that long ago, I would say maybe 15 years ago, the whole concept of peacekeeping, especially in internal conflicts, was just considered too politically difficult. But now what Beijing has done has identified so-called good versus bad examples of intervention. And obviously the good involves the Security Council, involves a very multilateral framework, and involves as clear an exit strategy as one can. More recently, there have been a much greater discussion about supplementing blue berets, quote unquote. In other words, support personnel, combat engineers, which up until recently formed the bulk of the personnel that China was sending to these missions. Now we're starting to see more blue helmets. Now we're starting to see some more serious discussion about combat forces. But even now, there's still a bit of insecurity about that, both due to a lack of experience, as well as China's still very concerned about how its military is viewed abroad. But in the cases, again, of Mali and to a lesser degree the Central African Republic, Sudan, and South Sudan, we are starting to see a change in thinking. So, and of course, China now, out of the P5, sends the most number of peacekeepers abroad each year. So it's a pretty remarkable change. Uh-oh. Am I in trouble?
Yes, because China has also moved up from being a not very large contributor financially to peacekeeping to becoming the second largest financial contributor this year. And it is currently vying for the DPKO post or DFS, and it's going to probably get one of them because it's now the main player outside of the US, and the US doesn't want to deploy troops. So things are changing and fast, and we need to take China into account going forward.
Completely agree. Thank you. Are there other questions? If not, I might take Chair's discretion and ask you 2 points that I was thinking of, especially during the start of your discussion. Now, the subject of Somalia, you were talking about examples of flexibility in missions. Now, Somalia produced 2 concepts, quote-unquote lessons, which are still being debated now. First of all, the problem of mission creep. The problem of, okay, if you have a mission that is simply too ambiguous or too kind of undefined, you have the issue of maybe the agenda being pushed outside boundaries, and in the case of Somalia, certainly contributed to the failure that has been described. So that would be the first concept. The second has to do with the subject of neutrality or impartiality. Now, again, this is very much open to the eye of the beholder, as you correctly point out. But for many years after the Somalia missions wrapped up, there was a discussion of the so-called Mogadishu line. In other words, as soon as you cross over, as soon as you get too far away from impartiality, you are setting yourself up for a huge amount of added risk and greater possibility of failure. So I'm just curious about how those 2 concepts, maybe not only in the Somalia case, but otherwise, maybe fit in with your data gathering.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question. And the question of mission creep, again, is very linked to the mandate. And if we look at UNOSOM 2, the mandate was nothing less than establishing a new country. And of course, you cannot get out of mission creep when that's the goal, because of course, you will never achieve that goal. So this has to do with the ambiguity of the mandate, and that's why I add, when I talk about the accomplishment of the mandate, I look at what is actually accomplished, given the context, the constraints, and the duration of those peace operations. With regards to neutrality and impartiality, you're right that one of the more than faux pas, but the problem is that they started focusing the Americans on this third mission, United, some two, on chasing ID'd and making a chase of the warlord and losing the other picture. So they also lost that. That goes with, you lose neutrality and impartiality when you cut communications with the peace gap or with the population and the belligerents. And that's what they did. And that's why as well in my results, I show that deterrence works, because deterrence implies that you have strong communication with the population and the belligerents, of course, because deterrence is all about knowing what makes them tick. Deterrence is all about the effectiveness of threats and the assurance that the threats will be put into applications if a prohibited action is committed. So deterrence relies on communications with the population and the belligerents. When you overstep that rule, when you go after one warlord, you cut communications both with the belligerents and the population, and that's when you set yourself to failure, because you block this communication that is key and is essential in any success of the mission. The interveners need to understand what the population wants, the population needs, etc. So that would be my answer. So it's not so much about neutrality and impartiality, rather than keeping the lines of communication.
Okay, are there other questions? Well, if I could just jump in again, just the point that you made about state building, about any particular mission which involves a great deal of state building. There have been some cases, and some people might debate me on this, where you've had missions that essentially paint a country blue, to use the British term, and have been relatively successful. I'm thinking Cambodia, Namibia to a degree. So again, do they provide maybe some examples of how a mission can be successful under sometimes very difficult conditions? Like Cambodia was extremely difficult under the circumstances that were in place at the time.
I did not study that mission, but of course, if I had taken a larger sample, I think Cambodia would have been an example of success. East Timor would have been as well a case interesting to look at. But I really focus on those three cases of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Somalia. So it's hard for me to comment on those cases, which I did not study too much.
There are a lot of variations. Okay, are there any other questions? Well, good. Okay. Well, if that's the case, first of all, let me just say that Sarah-Myriam's new book, Evaluating Peacekeeping Missions, A Typology of Success and Failure in International Interventions, is out now. It is published by Routledge, and it is on sale, so highly recommended reading, so to let you know. And also, Sarah-Myriam is passing through Oslo, and we're very lucky she was able to come here. She is on her way to Paris and then to Bangui. So will everyone please join me in wishing her very happy travels and very successful research to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Have a good afternoon.